Fertile and Trivet, and I'd like to tell you today about baking soda, baking powder, what the difference is between them, and what it looks like when they're good versus what it looks like when they're too old. I'm going to start with baking soda. It's a naturally occurring base. It's also called bicarbonate of soda or sodium bicarbonate. The best way to test your baking soda is to see whether or not it reacts with an acid, which is just what it would do in your baking. In your baking, it would react with an acid like buttermilk or natural cocoa powder or something like that, fruits, in order to have this acid-base reaction that we're going to see right here. But today I'm going to use just distilled white vinegar, which normally you wouldn't put in your baking, but it is an acid that will react with the baking soda. I'm going to use a tablespoon of vinegar and a teaspoon of soda, and we'll see quite a violent reaction happens. It's very large and it bubbles and fizzes, and that's the reaction you want. It'll create all of those bubbles inside of your baking and make it fluffy. That's called leavening. Baking powder, on the other hand, doesn't need an acid in order to have the reaction because the acid is built into the baking powder. Baking powder is made up of about 30% baking soda, about 15% total of two acids, and the rest is just cornstarch. And the cornstarch is in there to keep the acid in the base from absorbing moisture and reacting too early, which is definitely not what we want. One of the acids in the baking powder will do its reaction with the base right away as soon as there's moisture getting the molecules to touch each other. But the second one will need some heat in order to allow the reaction to happen. So I'm going to put about 2 tablespoons of water into this tablespoon of baking powder, and we'll see what happens. It's not quite as violent of a reaction as with the baking soda, but it is quite large, and it takes up most of the bowl, and it makes quite a nice fizzing noise. Now, if I show you what happens if we do a baking powder that's about 1.5 years old, it's a different reaction. Well, it's a different visual. The reaction is the same, but it doesn't happen quite as much because the baking soda in the baking powder has gotten so old. So again, I've got a tablespoon of baking powder. This is the old baking powder, and I'm going to put in 2 tablespoons of water from my little beaker, and we'll see that almost nothing happens. Well, it does do a little bit of fizzing, but it definitely didn't fizz as high as the newer baking powder did. I'll show you a closer shot at that reaction in just a minute. Here are the 2 reactions side by side. Again, we're going to use a tablespoon of each baking powder. The old one is on the left and the new one is on the right. And then at the same time, we're going to add 2 tablespoons of water to each of these little bowls. And you'll see how much higher the reaction is in the new baking powder than in the old baking powder. And that's what you want to see in order to know that your baking powder is still good. And if it's not still good, you're going to get cakes like we see in the next scene. Now that we've waited a little bit, you can see that there's still a lot of bubbles in the one on the right and not very many bubbles at all in the one on the left. And that shows that there's a lot more activity going on in the baking powder on the right that's newer. Here are 2 cakes. The one on the left was made with old expired baking powder, and the one on the right was made with brand new baking powder. You can see that the one on the right is a little bit taller and a little bit brighter and more appetizing looking. I'll also cut open both of the cakes so that we can see what the insides look like. So here we have a slice of each cake from the cakes I showed you earlier, and still on the left is the one with the old baking powder, and on the right is the one with the new baking powder. And you can't see a ton of difference in the height, But if you look really closely at the crumb structure, that's the little holes in the cake, there are a lot bigger holes in the cake on the left and a lot more evenness in the holes in the cake on the right. And I can also tell you that I tasted these cakes, and the cake with the old baking powder had a bitterness and a lot less sweetness, and the cake on the right with the new baking powder is much more tender and sweet and lovely to eat. So that's a good reason to use newer baking powder. You can make your own baking powder. All you need is 1/3 baking soda for how much baking powder the recipe calls for, and 1/6 as much cream of tartar as the recipe calls for. So if you need a tablespoon of baking powder, you use a teaspoon of baking soda and half a teaspoon of cream of tartar, and that will make up as much as you need for a tablespoon of baking powder. Thank you. Thank you for watching Spurtle and Trivet. I hope you learned something and come back again. Thank you.